86% of women under the age of 40 in the UK support abortion rights.
Mm-hmm.
Is it time for Gen Z to normalise abortion?
I have always said that it's about time that we regarded abortion as being a fact of life for people. And I say that because we have an expectation in society now. I think even people who are opposed to abortion have an expectation that we will plan our families. And we have an expectation that sex isn't always about wanting to have a child. And if we have those expectations, we need to be able to decide when a pregnancy is the right thing to have. And contraception alone can't always do that. And so I think if we have those expectations, then we need to accept that abortion will be a backup to contraception. And I think that put contraception and abortion together and you get birth control. And I think that birth control needs to be accepted as normal and indeed a morally okay thing for people to do.
I can imagine that someone pro-life would just say to you, sure, maybe it should be accepted as a fact of life, but also another fact of life is the creation of life itself. So is it not the case that you're going against actively what should be a fact of life and is biologically by intervening?
Well, I think that it's almost... Okay, let me take a step back on this because I am perfectly prepared to agree that from the time of conception, a woman is carrying a biological life within her.
Would you go as far as saying she's carrying a human?
Yes, of course. I mean, what on earth else would it be? What you've got when you've got an embryo is you have a human embryo. It's not guinea pig. It's not a horse. It's clearly a human embryo, and it's clearly distinct from her. It has its own genetic makeup, right from the completion of fertilization. But I think it's a life that's different to your life and my life. We're talking about a life that doesn't really know that it's alive. And I think that we have to allow women, the pregnant woman, the ability to make a moral judgment about whether it's the right or the wrong thing to do to have that embryonic life develop into the human being that it will naturally become. You know, in our modern society, we intervene against nature all the time. We do it every time that we cure a disease. So let's not pretend it's anything different.
Flesh that out for me a little bit more. The fertilized egg, it's a human, but it's in a different form. How is it different morally? Is there a difference? Obviously, it's different to a human standing in front of you in corporeal form. But yeah. How else does it actually differ? This sounds like a very obvious question, but I think it delves into a little bit more of the moral aspects of this.
I think it's actually a very, very important question because, and I think it is very important when it comes to abortion because it picks up on something that is very, very real, which is the difference between a blastocyst and the embryo in its very, very earliest stages and a newborn. From the perspective of that new life, it is truly an incremental growth. One day is followed by the next day, and one change leads to the next. But something very fundamental happens along that course. And I think The only thing that is a really fundamental difference is that at a particular point, birth happens. Now, why do I say that birth is particularly important? It's because at that time, you have two beings that are distinct in the sense that the baby is no longer within the woman. It's no longer something that its life is entirely dependent on hers. And that brings about a change. And it brings about a change because until that point, there is nothing that anyone can do to the embryo, to the fetus, without it impacting on the woman. After that point, anything can happen without it impacting on the woman. And one of the things that concerns me about pregnancy and concerns me about the abortion debate is that we always talk about the changing status of the embryo or the fetus, and we fail to recognize that nothing in the woman's status changes. So when she says that she can't cope with the pregnancy, that is a very real thing to her, whether she's 5 days pregnant or 5 weeks or 5 months.
There must be a difference, though, between whether she's 5 days or 5 weeks pregnant. Do you think there's a big difference there, or do you think it's all the same?
I think there is a massive difference for the woman. I think that people forget, commentators, politicians, journalists forget what a huge difference there is for the woman. And that's absolutely the reason why you will get a significant amount of women perhaps deciding at 5 days or 5 weeks that they do not want to continue with the pregnancy, but you get a tiny, tiny number of women at 5 months deciding that they're not going to proceed, because once you have started to feel that child move within you, then you really do begin to change your view of it.
I want us to start with maybe some of the more objective metrics and see if we can get to any at all with this. A common pushback would be the status changes when a fetus or a baby leaves the birth canal. Someone would just go, okay, so is it okay to stab a baby in the head when it hasn't left the birth canal? Someone who's pro-life. What do you think to that argument, where clearly if we're relying on a baby actually being born, there are certain implications morally that come with that in terms of what also becomes permissible before birth?
I think there are moral implications with that. Of course there are. But I tell you what I find the problem with some of these discussions is that they actually simply become the level of thought experiments. Because in practice, you know and I know that nobody ever is going to do that. And it's a little bit like, imagine, for example, utilitarians always use the trolley problem, right? You've got, you can flick a switch and you can control whether or not the large rock coming along the track hits the trolley with 5 people or the trolley with one person in it. Morally, which is going to be the right thing to do. And of course, it's an abstract exercise, and we all and ah about it and say, well, it's better for 5 people to be allowed to live than for 1 person, and you switch it in that direction. Well, really, it's all about context. Actually, if your child is the 1 person, maybe you're going to think about it a little bit differently than you are about 4 strangers. And we can have lots and lots of discussions about this. What I would say is that with abortion, we also have to think about the moral context in which the questions are going to be asked. So is an abortion, let's say, at 38 weeks, that's 2 weeks before the baby would be born. Is that going to be morally permissible or not? I mean, after all, my own son was born at 38 weeks. So am I going to allow an abortion at 38 weeks? The kickback answer to it, the knee-jerk answer to it would be absolutely not. That would be a really terrible thing to do. And then you look at the abortion statistics, and in particular, you look at those statistics on very, very late abortions. They're tiny. The number are really tiny. But you look and you see that an abortion is recorded in the English statistics at being, say, 36 or 37 weeks pregnant. And you think, what on earth could have caused a woman to decide that she will terminate her pregnancy at that stage? What on earth could have been behind doctors' decisions to carry out an abortion at that stage? And you think, well, they must be the most heartless, most cruel, most feckless people. And then you start talking to people who concern themselves with the care of women who are pregnant with with infants that would be born with very short, desperately painful lives. And you find out that in some very rare cases, perhaps a woman will want to continue a pregnancy as long as she can before having what will probably be, she would feel, would be a necessary termination, because she's trying to keep that child with her as long as possible, and that in fact she's chosen to have a later abortion rather than an early abortion because she just can't bear to have the abortion earlier on. The pregnancy was always going to end in abortion because maybe the baby doesn't have a brain. Maybe it would just die after being born, and this is an easier way of having the delivery. Is that as bad? I don't really think it is. And that's why I think that at the end of the day, abortion is really contextual, and it's really as a moral issue for the woman who is pregnant and for the doctors who are carrying out the termination itself. Mm-hmm. Let them decide.
It opens up a whole can of worms of practicality and contextually based arguments.
It does.
But we still haven't found any objective ground, and maybe we won't. And I wonder if that's because this argument that you're putting forward is philosophically inconsistent, or it's lazy, or it's not quite made its way to being perfect and irrefutable. Or is it that pro-lifers are actually caught up in this utopia of having this perfect metric for when an abortion should take place, which is never.
Yeah.
And they're being unrealistic.
I think what it is I think that, it's hard. When you say that it's an inconsistent philosophical argument, you may very well be right. And it may be that I am still really working on this, and I'm perfectly content to admit that I don't think that I've got the easy to explain answers on it, because I don't actually think that there is an objective metric with abortion itself. I think that it's a clinical procedure that some people think is absolutely morally objectionable. Some people think it's absolutely morally unobjectionable. And most people fall somewhere between the two. And I think that if you try and find an objective metric, it falls by the wayside on all directions. People who are absolutely against abortion will never be content with that, because they see that even though I would argue that embryonic life is not like the life that you and I have, they will say, well, it is ensouled from the very beginning, or there is no magical moment when it transforms into that different kind of life. And of course, they're right about that. I might argue, well, if I believe that the pregnant woman is the one who will live with the consequences of the pregnancy, whether she has the abortion or whether she has the child, that she will live with the weight of that decision. So she must make it, and she knows the most about her own consequences. And that is what I do believe. Then I will never concede that there is a moment where she should not have the moral right to trump an external person's moral argument, and we will never meet. I think that what we have to do is to accept that there is no objective metric. I think that we have to accept that we aspire to live in a society that is tolerant and has an acceptance of conscience, and that is that we have the capacity, and I think that we should have the right to make these controversial decisions for ourselves. And that's why I get into trouble with my colleagues the whole time, because I believe that there are no circumstances where any woman should ever be forced into an abortion, in the same way that I think that no woman should ever be forced to have a child.
There's a key difference there, though, and this will come from pro-lifers. The whole point is that they are pro-life.
Yes.
That transcends everything else.
Yeah.
And sometimes their arguments can be very infantilizing by not letting women choose and thinking that they will make the best decision. But also at the same time, you can just go, yeah, people make mistakes, people make the wrong decisions sometimes, and a life is worth more than her comfort, even if she experiences discomfort, which, by the way, she doesn't do, because after 5 years, the Turnaway study finds that 95% of women who did have the child didn't regret it. Interestingly, I want to make this point because Lois missed this out. Lois McLatchie, your friend, who's staunchly pro-life.
Yes.
She missed out that the Turnaway study found the same with people that did have the abortion after 5 years. 95% were happy that they had the abortion. So it seems that there's no difference substantially after 5 years between people that were turned away and people that had the abortion. So that's interesting to bring up. But with this, something that fascinates me about this whole debate, this whole argument, is the moral judgments you have to make to hold a certain position.
Yeah.
So, pro-lifers, life transcends your comfort or discomfort. Pro-choicers, choice supersedes that. And I think rooted within that is the idea that life isn't sacred when you're a pro-choicer, because you've said yourself, and I know that a lot of people will agree with you who are pro-choicers, that there is no moment when an embryo becomes a human suddenly. It's a human from conception. And then it's like, okay, you are killing a human. And I'm pro-choice, but I've really had to turn myself inside out thinking about this. And one of the big problems I had, especially speaking to Lois, was the fact that I just have to concede philosophically that a human life is not sacred. And sacred, I think, is an interesting word because it gives off religious connotations and the fact that life is sort of given to us by God and he warrants it. And you're going against that. I'm not religious, so like that's not really a problem. But it's changed my perspective on everything because, I mean, we were speaking about this before we started rolling. These Judeo-Christian values that we've inherited, they get us to buy into this idea of equality.
Mm-hmm.
All human lives, if not perhaps sacred, they're at least, I mean, they almost are sacred without using that word. I don't know what you'd otherwise use. But I've felt that my entire life, and I still do. But philosophically, I'm inconsistent because the ideas I hold go against that idea. How do you square this circle?
Oh my God! So the reason why I'm smiling, and the reason why I'm smiling and I'm laughing at you, is because although there are some points that you raised earlier that I want to come back on, but this last point that you make, which I think is absolutely huge, I think it's really true. And I am struggling with exactly the same point, because I'm now studying philosophy. I'm currently doing a doctorate in philosophy at a university in Belgium.
Interesting. What specifically within philosophy?
And, well, this is the interesting thing. I'm looking at the human difference and what makes us different to other animal species. Is there anything? And if there is, what is it that privileges humanity? And I think and it has come about because, and I won't go too much into this, we can talk about this on another occasion, but it's come about because I think that there is a huge tendency at the moment to want to blur the boundaries between human life and the lives of other forms of animals.
What do you mean?
Blur the boundaries. Well, perhaps what I will do is we'll just divergence into this because it does have a thing. I was sent a book to review. I sent a book to review for Spiked Online, which was called Animal Love. And it talked about what we used to call bestiality as just being another form of queering. And the notion is that there really isn't something special about humans, that it is speciesist to draw a boundary around our own species in exactly the same way that within queer philosophy, people say it's a problematic to define women in a biological way or men in a biological way. So they're saying it's problematic to define species in a particular way. And it really got me thinking about what happens if you start blurring that very important boundary. And it's led to me reading a very little discussed philosopher called Del Sol. And she's contemporary. She's Catholic. Charlotte Del Sol has written some, what I feel are very important works on looking at the importance of maintaining a boundary around what is human. And she makes the point that once we start blurring that boundary of what is human, then we run into all kinds of problems, not just about when we talk about human rights, but when we talk about the sanctity of human life. And of course, what she does is she throws abortion as being a transgression of that boundary of what is human life. And certainly the discussions about assisted dying as being a transgression of what is human life. And I think that's true. I think what she says with that is true. I think that there is something about the dignity of human life that is very, very special, and somehow we must not transgress. But at the same time, and this is what I find is a genuine philosophical, a genuine problem of within moral philosophy, is the point that one of the things that is very, very particular to humans is our ability to make moral judgments. Moral judgments about our lives, moral judgments in relation to our family, moral judgments in relation to the way that we want the world to be. And I think that when it comes to issues around pregnancy, this becomes really difficult. It becomes, it genuinely becomes a problem, because I spent most of my working life, as you know, being in charge of abortion clinics. And I have spent so much time talking to women in the waiting rooms of abortion clinics and talking to them about the reasons why they are making the decision to end that embryonic human life. And I know that they do not do it to exercise a choice. They don't do it because they can. They're doing it because they really feel that it is the right thing. It is morally the right thing for them to do. Not just for themselves, but for their existing children, for the integrity of their family, and even sometimes for that life that would be born. And so it's a struggle. I'm struggling with it at the moment. And I honestly can't tell you where that struggle is going to end. I think it amuses my supervisor no end. My supervisor is a Catholic, very practicing Catholic, 100% anti-abortion. And I think he's very interesting where I'm going to land on these particular questions. But right now, what I can say absolutely 100% is the abortion question for me, the most important moral question, is not in fact the one of when does that life become sacred, but it's actually about who decides and when do you say to a woman that she no longer can make a moral decision for herself in relation to that. So I agree. I think morals are messy. And that's why generally I think we need to leave this question to the woman herself.
I really want us to pick up on the question of who decides.
Yeah.
But I want to put something really coldly first. And
go on.
This is definitely going to get clipped out of context. I'm going to get cancelled for this.
Go on.
But it's not the view I hold, certainly. But to entertain the idea, say a woman is disgustingly raped by another man. She's had her inviolable rights violated.
Yeah.
And it's a moral wrong.
Yeah.
All of us intuitively will wince at me even bringing this idea up. We all know inherently that that's a disgusting act and there's been a moral injustice committed there.
Yeah.
If you zoom out from there and you think, okay, so there are certain inviolable rights, and obviously a woman who's unconsensually been forced into having a baby should be able to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Zoom out one step further and you're like, okay, but what about another inviolable right, or at least maybe if it's not a right, something that our species depends on, is what actually makes us exist as a species, which perhaps is this myth that we buy into of sacred life. What are the consequences downstream from allowing even that lady, in an extreme example, to have an abortion, or maybe to take a more normal example, someone that's hooked up on a one-night stand, unprotected, and they've fallen pregnant, they've had an abortion. Why do any of those inviolable rights unviolable rights, perhaps, actually matter if long-term they lead to the fundamental collapse of humanity. And I know humanity's, I mean, who knows, but it's not going to collapse purely because we allow abortion and we lose the idea of sacred life from that. But I think that could be a piece in the jigsaw puzzle of this thing that's unfolding in front of us now, which is people, generally speaking, losing this idea of sacred life. Everything's subjective. Man descended from apes, therefore we should love one another. And it's like these two contradictory ideas that we hold, and they don't work. So should we be prioritizing these inviolable rights that all intuitively feel good to us and just if they come at the cost of humanity?
Oh my God. Well, what you say, right, is an argument that is quite often articulated when I meet people who are conservative, who find my involvement in abortion care incomprehensible. And I find their opposition to a woman's right to make her own decisions for herself incomprehensible, because my view on it is very straightforward, which is that if you honestly believe in a small state, if you honestly believe that people must take responsibility for their actions, then how can you say that the state should dictate when a woman should have a child and not have a child? How can you take that decision away from her? That is not a liberal position. That's not a conservative position. You don't want the state to control that. And they look at me and they say, but if you honestly have faith in humanity, if you honestly believe in the dignity of human life, how can you possibly support a woman's right to abortion where that can be seen to impinge on the dignity of human life? And I come back again, I think, to the question of, well, what do we mean by the dignity of human life? And, what do we mean by it? What do we mean by rights? What do we mean by all of these things, which to my mind seem to have lost a lot of meaning in the contemporary discourse?
How so?
Well, I think it leads to a thing where, so for example, when we talk about rights these days, and we talk, for example, about the right to decide about abortion, I think that people get very confused about it, and it's as though they almost imagine that a woman marches into an abortion clinic to exercise her right to have an abortion in the same way that she exercises her right to vote. That you are demonstrating a belief in something. And of course they don't. What happens is that we have those moral values and the way of living that we want to aspire to have. But at the same time, we recognize that sometimes these things, our lives are not, and our value systems are not perfect, and we need to compromise on where we are.
Something that plays into this, a key part, and something that I hate that's emerged, is this sloganization of politics.
Absolutely.
You have these initial, perhaps philosophical ideas, and they come with certain phrases that are shorthand. Something like my body, my choice, or Black Lives Matter, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
There are ideas underpinning those slogans, but over time, the ideas get eroded, and all that's left are the slogans, and they become the idea. And it just doesn't map on the same way to reality when your justification for abortion is my body, my choice, or your fight against anti-racism is Black Lives Matter. Perhaps you should look into what that actually means more. And I don't know if it's laziness, if it's because of social media, if it's other factors at play, but it's so pervasive. This
I completely
sloganization
agree.
of everything.
I completely agree. So, for example, this is one of the things that I think is really challenging at the moment is take the point, my body, my choice. Okay? Now, as I was growing up and through, my professional life working in abortion care, my body, my choice meant something very, very particular. And it meant that when it came to the abortion discussion, it recognized that abortion is a clinical procedure and that therefore it needs doctors to be involved to carry the abortion out. But my body, my choice meant when it came to the moral decision about about whether or not I should terminate the pregnancy, the moral choice should be mine. And it should be mine because the pregnancy was residing in my body. And so the intervention that you make as a doctor or that you don't make is going to be against me. And it was really a slogan that picked up not just the notion that women might decide that they don't feel able to continue a pregnancy at a particular time, but it was also one that picked up against doctors' views and politicians' views sometimes that there were certain women who should not be allowed to have children. It's me, it's my body, it's my choice whether I have children or not. It's nobody else's. Now you look at the way that that slogan, my body, my choice, is picked up. And it's picked up, for example, within the trans discussion as being, it's my body, I can do whatever I want with my body. I can choose to have my breasts removed. I can choose to take hormone blockers. I can do a whole load of other things with my body that are a million miles away from that framing of it, which was partly against a eugenic drive to decide who were fit mothers and who were unfit mothers. So I think you're absolutely 100% right. We have to get behind the slogans, which brings us back all the time to the abortion discussion, because one of the things that absolutely completely does my head in, and it's really hard to explain this, because I would describe myself as being instinctively pro-life, instinctively pro-human life. Actually, not just instinctively pro-human life. I am the person who wafts the wasp out of the room rather than kill it, because I'm even a bit weird about plants and stuff. I feel guilty if my pot plant is dying because I feel that I have neglected the life of that plant. I have that element within myself. But at the same time, I think with the abortion discussion, we always have to come back to context. And for me, the most important context of abortion is not the existence of an embryo and the ending, or fetus, and the ending of its life, but it's one about the context of those of us that are living, moral, decision-making human beings, and what it means when you take somebody's decision away from them. And this might not be an area that you want to pursue, but I just want to leave this hanging in the air. You see, I cannot imagine what it would mean to force a woman to end a pregnancy. The idea of compelling a pregnant woman to have an abortion, it sits outside of my capacity to imagine the pain and anguish and hellishness that involves. But at the same time, I feel exactly the same way about forcing a woman to continue a pregnancy when she really thinks it's wrong to do that. Because it is not just about, pregnancy is not just about being in discomfort for a few months, delivering a baby and handing it over to somebody else. It's about all the moral responsibility of knowing that you have brought another life into the world. And that is huge.
I want us to get on to speaking about who actually chooses. We've kind of glossed over it a few times, but let's go into it properly. And I think linked to this, Judith Jarvis Thompson, she speaks about this in her Defense of Abortion, about third parties' involvement and the moral implications to that. She also mentions the classic analogy of a woman housing this person, and the baby is essentially a visitor in the house. And there are tons of different things we can pick up on, but I'd rather just hand it over to you. What do you mean with who chooses being the most important factor at play here?
Okay. I think that as a woman, well, I'm a bit past the pregnancy thing now, but let's assume in my younger self, as a woman, I may have certain views about abortion before I become pregnant. I can almost guarantee that when a woman becomes pregnant, when she sees that positive pregnancy test, she reviews everything that she has thought before about whether or not she wants to have a child or not. Because suddenly I am moving away from the theoretical and the abstract to the practicality. I'm moving away to not do I want to become a mother at some point in the future, but within X number of months, I will become a mother or a mother again unless I do something about it. So I'm then needing to review everything. My life is literally, I am standing at a fork in the road. And each of those is a decision which has a huge moral burden that's attached to it. And I will carry that regardless of the choice that I make. And deciding to, if I decide to continue the pregnancy, then you could say that the burden that I will carry is a very obvious and a very known one. It will be that I will have a child. But if I don't, if I end that pregnancy, well, do you know what? It isn't, I would argue, almost never the case that for a woman, that's just a shrug and a continuation with life as though nothing has happened beforehand. Every time she looks at herself in the mirror from that moment on, she knows that part of her identity is, I am the woman who chose not to have that child at that time. And that's why I say it rests on the woman, because the burden rests on her. Now, it also rests to a certain extent on some doctors, because there are issues about whether doctors should be. And I'm a strong believer in conscientious objection. I honestly think that anybody who feels that they don't want to be involved in abortion services definitely should not be involved in abortion services. But, there's a moral... There's clearly a moral question for doctors about whether or not they think it's right or wrong. But at the end of the day, it's their job. They go home. They've done something that is according with their medical practice. They don't live with it.
Why does that matter, though? Just to throw this spanner into the works as well and derail us for the 7th time that I keep on doing. But there's just so much to pick your brains about. Like, why does it matter that it's the doctor's job? You could say that an SS trooper had certain jobs that were morally repugnant.
Yeah.
And you could compel them to just go, yeah, but it's your job. Do it. So does that hold up just the argument that it's the doctor's job?
Well, I think that, I've heard it likened to the argument that when I say that a doctor should not be forced to do something that they think is morally repugnant, I've heard it likened to me saying that someone who works on a forecourt of a petrol station should be able to opt out of using petrol because they've gone green and they think that it's wrong to fill up a car with petrol. For heaven's sake, it is not like that. There are certain things that we feel in our very being it is the wrong thing to do. And I think that people do not put on their values like a kind of white coat, in a sense. But nevertheless, when a doctor opts in to being a doctor, there are certain things that they accept perhaps that they are going to do. I think as far as possible, we want to excuse them from doing things that go against their inner core values, in the same way that I think that we should allow women to make decisions that go with their inner core values. So, I don't have any problems with doctors saying that they want to opt out of abortion particularly. I think it is a kind of special case.
I can imagine a world where perhaps abortion is more normalized and it's common, and then you have all of these doctors that are Christians and they're just being like forced into doing abortions. I wonder if you kind of get a split where you have like Christian hospitals that you go to just to entertain the idea. I don't know what would happen.
No, I think I think there's an interesting discussion that comes about when you believe in conscientious objection. I found myself in a very weird situation of a working party that somebody had put together to discuss this issue, and we were talking with some people from the United States and from Canada. And I found it utterly weird that they were completely happy with the idea of conscientious objection when it came to abortion. But they were very unhappy about the idea of conscientious objection when it came to assisted dying. And whereas I found myself in the position of being a conscientious objection absolutist, I can't imagine the situation where a doctor is forced to be involved in an assisted dying decision when they think it's absolutely wrong. And it was put to me, well, for heaven's sake, if you're the only doctor, say in northern Canada, and you're being flown in because it's somebody's right to end their life, and you're saying, well, no, I really don't agree with it, that's utterly unfair. I'm thinking, well, are you seriously suggesting that a doctor should be compelled to do what they think is murder? I mean, that just seems utterly bizarre.
Especially if you believe in a person's right to conscientiously object. That's a tongue twister.
Yeah.
To life.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, you can conscientiously object to life. That doctor can also conscientiously object to ending your life. I think that makes complete sense, especially if that doctor's still going to have to live with the consequences.
Yeah.
I want to ask you this. What would get you to change your stance on abortion to be pro-life?
Well, you see, I think I am pro-life.
Okay.
So,
what would
so,
get you...
so let me.
Let's flesh this out really clearly. What would get you to change your stance to the point that you would have abortion banned?
I honestly, I'm really quite prepared to give this serious consideration. So I'm not being glib about this at all. But I cannot actually imagine anything, because what you're asking me to do is to say, what circumstances are there that mean that you would decide that a woman is not allowed to make very moral choices for herself just because she's pregnant?
That is the question.
I mean, that for me is the thing. And I think being forced to do something that you, in your very soul, let me use that word, in your very soul, believe is utterly wrong, is the most dehumanizing thing. And I think that would be my rebuttal to the points we were discussing earlier about throwing a boundary around what is the dignity of human life. The dignity of human life is forcing us to do something that we think is absolutely 100% wrong. Because I suppose what it is, it's because I believe that we kind of construct ourselves. We become what we are through the choices that we make. Maybe that's why I think the ability to, and the responsibility, allowing us to take responsibility for our choices is so important. And I was really, really influenced by Mary Kenny. If she ever listens to your podcast, she would probably be rolling on the floor laughing about this. But so Mary Kenny, as you know, is a famously Irish, famously Catholic, famously articulate journalist who is famously anti-abortion. And back in the day, I'm probably going back about, probably more than 30 years, she and I have been, debating on this particular question. And she said something in a debate, way before you were a twinkle in your parents' eye. And she said to me about abortion that so many people think that abortion is wrong, but the right thing to do in their circumstances. And that has stayed with me all my working life, because I think it is so true. It's so borne out by my own experience of talking to women who have abortion. Nobody wants it. Nobody ever wants to have an abortion. But there are circumstances where even if they think it's wrong, they think it's the right thing to do.
I take issue with this idea a little bit of not being able to be convinced by anything. I mean, people say, you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And oftentimes I think if you can't be reasoned out of something, that is the case, that potentially it's a more emotionally loaded claim rather than backed up by anything. And I know we're rapidly discovering as this conversation unfolds that perhaps there are a lot more things that aren't objective, yet they can somehow kind of still be directed through a somewhat close to objective lens. But my brain just still takes such issue with this.
I know.
And it's so difficult. But I think...
But it is difficult. Can I just say,
for me to change my opinion on this,
Yeah.
for me to suddenly become like anti-abortion vehemently, every pro-choicer is completely wrong. I think it would be the demonstration of human life being sacred. That's what would change my opinion on it. Because then you're fundamentally going against this idea of sacred life by killing a human. Whereas for me and with my worldview, I'm agnostic or atheist, whatever you want to call it. I don't take that position that human life is sacred, even if I perhaps hold it to be somewhat close in the way I treat people and think of people. At the moment, it's like, yeah, it's fair game. And that's a very horrible way of putting it. Obviously, there are loads of other things underpinning it. But you can see what I'm saying. It doesn't make sense to be completely anti-abortion unless you believe that fundamental principle of sacred human life and God creating life. Because then it's obvious that you don't outlaw it, right?
Yeah, I think that's I think where you are is more or less right. And I think that in some ways some of the discussion that I've had with honest opponents on this issue does actually come down to that. It comes down to the fact that you believe that God created the embryo and has adorned it with the value that is accorded to every member of humanity from its earliest days, and I don't. And there isn't really any kind of meeting of minds on that. But I think it comes down to something. One of the things that really bugs me, and I haven't worked out a way of dealing with it myself, but it is this sort of question about science and rationality. And do we draw absolutely all of our answers from life about following the science? Or is there something more that informs our moral viewpoints than that? Because
that sounds quite religiously loaded.
And why is it that when we talk about this, we say that it's religiously loaded? Because that maybe in itself is religiously loaded. But, I think there is a genuine question that we make value judgments. And I think abortion actually is all about value judgments.
Okay, well,
and
I think...
with a crucial word there being judgment.
Well, I think this is the perfect question to ask. And I'm going to be frank here with you.
You be frank.
And not Frank Furedi, by the way.
No, definitely not Frank Furedi. Yeah.
I'll spare you me role-playing as you...
Yeah, no. Let's not do role-playing. Yeah.
Do you not think the fact that you've highlighted to me that you can't imagine anything that would convince you to change your stance to that stance, it just undermines your whole argument? Would it be fair to me to just say to you now, based on that, I think you're arguing off of emotion, and that's it? And there's a slippery slope from this that leads into moral relativism and subjectivism and all the things that you hate in modern culture that go along with that.
No, I don't think it follows at all, because I think that what I'm doing is, I think I'm looking, for me, about when we talk about the dignity of human life and what is special about human life, what marks us out as the fact that we are even having this discussion marks us out from other species. It's what is important about humanity. And it is our ability to determine what is right and what is wrong. It is a moral code that we adopt for ourselves. And I don't think that that is something that is provable. And what I'm saying is an absolute value for me is somebody's ability to make a morally contested decision for themselves. And I do not have it. I cannot imagine the circumstances where I would willingly concede that someone should take on the enormity of the responsibility that is parenting without them willingly engaging in that. I don't know. I mean, maybe if we go off into a fantasy world of, science fiction and the end of the human race, we might be talking about it slightly differently. But even then, I can't even think, how can you do that? How can you take away somebody's ability to decide? It's like asking me, under what circumstances would you think it is right to deprive someone who has committed no crime of their ability to breathe,
Yeah. Oh, it's such a complex,
it's so complex
topic, and
it is so complex.
People never give it credit. And the thing that fascinates me is this battle between religion and atheism and the clarity that religion gives you. And it fascinates me. I'm so intrigued by it. And I've had a bunch of Christians on the show to discuss it. This idea of faith, where you have to make a leap of faith as a Christian, but you also need to make a leap of faith as an atheist in terms of moral arguments when you can't underpin something with everything. And I don't want us to get lost in the weeds too much. But
look, it made me start reading Kierkegaard. It is that difficult, who talks about this sort of the problems of the leap of faith, quite literally. And it is difficult for
But the difference is, when you make that leap of faith, you are still grounding all of your decisions in this one objective truth, which is the existence of God, right? Whereas with atheism, even the way we've evolved, it undercuts the justification for anything and for us being able to make rational decisions. I mean, C.S. Lewis has this amazing quote, and he says, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind, in that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It's merely the case that when the atoms inside my skull happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me as a byproduct the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thoughts to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping the way it splashes out will give you a map of London.
I do not feel that I am sufficiently competent to make an argument about intelligent design.
It's just a spanner, again, to throw in the works and something to bear in mind, taking our position that we both share.
It is a spanner in the works. I absolutely, completely agree with you. But I tell you one thing, and that is that this is why I actually believe that people who have a faith, and that people who can underpin their decision-making by a true belief in the existence of God and a literal interpretation of the Ten Commandments as being the word of God, I honestly think it is really easy. because then, at least on an actual sense of basic truth, you have a kind of colour by numbers guide as to how you can make decisions. I think that those of us that don't are really having to grapple with how we consider things. And I think that basically what has happened over the last couple of centuries is that there has almost been an attempt to replace God by science and to replace it by a kind of linear rationality that says that, well, we can. I mean, analytical philosophy famously did this by saying, well, the only things that we can prove are true are those that we can demonstrate empirically. And when I talked with a professor about doing the PhD that I'm wanting to do at the moment, he said, well, the only way that we could do that is if we hooked up with a psychology department and worked out an empirical experiment to demonstrate that animals don't think morally. Well, that is crazy stuff, because you can demonstrate that a cat, I don't know, 9 cats out of 10 prefer whiskers because it's got fish in it. But you can't demonstrate that 9 cats out of 10 prefer whiskers because it's got ethically as opposed to unethically grown ingredients. It's crazy. But with morality, I think we have to start thinking with slightly different constructs. And I don't know what those are. I ran an abortion service. I just think that it's wrong for women to be denied their ability to make decisions for themselves.
I want us to end on this, and people usually ask you this and other people this at the start of an interview to lay the context, but I think it's more interesting to ask it at the end. You ran an abortion service. How have you seen the attitudes shift over the last few decades? And what do you project going forwards is going to happen? Especially, I mean, this is kind of a Gen Z-centered podcast with me being 20. What do you see my generation doing going forwards?
Okay. This is a really difficult question to answer for me, because on the one hand, I see a generation that is much more liberally minded, I think, generally about abortion than we would ever have thought possible. And I think that the technologies that we have now will inevitably mean that the dividing line between abortion and contraception will become increasingly blurred. And I actually think that that's a good thing, because, as I said to you right at the very beginning, I think that whether we talk about abortion or whether we talk about contraception, we're talking about birth control. And we're talking about birth control in the context of family planning. What I think is horrendous, and I think that it runs partly along this, is that it means that we potentially have a generation that does not need to think quite so intensely about when human life begins to matter, because it doesn't need to consider that question quite so poignantly or purposefully as previous generations have done. And I think that that matters at the beginning of life. And I think that that matters at the end of life. And so I think that the problem that is going to confront society going forward is how we deal with those blurred line areas where we can't perhaps point to the science to give us answers, and we have to work it out according to our values. Now, for my generation, which is a generation, I think, where it was almost a de facto assumption that we thought that human life really mattered, I really wouldn't have been too concerned about that at a time when your generation, many of it, will say that the planet, the trees matter as much as the people. I really do worry.
And Furedi, we'll leave it there for now. We'll have to speak again because there's so much we haven't covered. And yeah, I've really enjoyed this. So thank you for coming on.
It's a great conversation.
Where can people find more of your work?
Oh God, that's a really big question. What I would really like people to do, if you're really interested in this topic, I've written a book called The Moral Case for Abortion, an argument for reproductive choice. The process of writing that book is actually what drove me to want to do, first of all, an MA in philosophy, and has led me on to a PhD. And I think that you find I think whichever side of the line you fall, you'll find something interesting in that. So that's what I'd ask you to take a look at.